We're still expecting a good number of people, but I think we have a very busy agenda, so I think we're going to get going. And I don't think I'm going to filibuster to allow more people to arrive as we start, but people will be arriving as we get started. Okay, let me begin by welcoming everyone to this conference on the Arab Spring after 2 years, in which we'll look at the prospects for democracy in the Gulf states, which is obviously one of the most critical sub-regions of the Arab Middle East. And this conference, as everyone knows, is also taking place one day before the second anniversary of the Pearl Revolution in Bahrain. And our second panel this morning will be looking at the prospects for a negotiated solution to the crisis there. And the NED is very pleased to be organizing this conference with POMED, an organization that has taken the lead in Washington in calling the attention of government officials, policy specialists, democracy advocates to the growing dangers and the need for democratic reform in the Gulf states. There are basically 3 reasons that we're holding this conference. The first is to express our solidarity with human rights defenders in Bahrain and the other Gulf states, so many of whom are in prison for their defense of democratic principles. The second is to keep emphasizing to the policy community in America and beyond that there is no contradiction between pressing for reform and defending our strategic interests, or between democracy and stability. Quite the contrary. Democratic reform is the only way to address the mounting pressures that will otherwise eventually erupt in a way that will endanger peace, stability, and our security. And the third reason is to support and encourage the very tentative and uncertain steps toward negotiation in Bahrain that now may have begun. And we'll be talking more about that as the morning progresses. I want to thank our friends who have joined us, traveling very long distances from the Gulf region. I don't think Mariam Al-Khawaja has arrived yet. I haven't seen her, but still I want to note that she will be with us this morning. She's been having a lot of meetings around town, and I think, as everyone knows, she's the daughter of the imprisoned Bahraini human rights defender Abdul Hadi Al-Khawaja. And it was my honor last October in Lima, Peru, to present her, and she received the World Movement for Democracy's Democracy Courage Tribute at the 7th Assembly of the World Movement, which took place in Lima. And she received it on behalf of the human rights defenders of Bahrain. And in her very memorable acceptance remarks, which appear in the current issue of the NED's Journal of Democracy, she explained that she drew inspiration from her father's view that the first and most important victory of the Arab uprisings lay not in the achievement of regime change or reform, but in the fact that she said that masses of people tread upon their fears, and went out to demand these things, democratic government and reform. And that this victory, as her father called it, called for celebration and not despair. And I think it's very important to remember that idea and the process that has been started in the Gulf as we meet today. Before we begin, I want to thank the members of the POMAD and NED staffs who have worked so hard in organizing this meeting, especially Cole Bockenfeld and Alex Russell, who are on Steve McInerney's team at POMED, and Hanan Zelouane Idrisi, Rahman Al-Jabouri, and Melissa Aiton Becknell of the NED. and we're grateful to all of you and everyone else who has helped out in organizing this. I also want to note that for those who are going to be following this on Twitter, you can follow the conference and contribute to the conversation with the hashtag NedEvents. And you can also follow the endowment at NedDemocracy and the Project on Middle East Democracy at POMEDWire. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Congressman Jim McGovern, who is the Democratic co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in the House of Representatives. At a time when too many Americans are looking inward as we try to deal with our very real and serious domestic problems, Congressman McGovern has held high the flame of freedom in authoritarian and conflicted countries. His interests are genuinely global. He was last at the NED in 2011 when he appeared with our Reagan Ficell Fellow, Holman Morris, from Colombia. And he was at the forefront of the successful battle in the Congress to pass the historic Magnitsky Act, which imposes sanctions on officials in Russia who violate human rights. It's one of the most significant pieces of human rights legislation in the last generation. And just last November, I had the pleasure of introducing him at a meeting sponsored in the Congress by POMED on the occasion of the publication of its assessment of the Bahrain government's implementation of the recommendations contained in the report of the Independent Commission of Inquiry that was chaired by Sharif Bassouni. There is actually no stronger voice in our Congress, and actually in our country, speaking out in defense of human rights than Congressman Jim McGovern. And we're very honored that he's taken the time and the trouble to be with us this morning. Congressman McGovern.
Well, thank you very much, Carl, for the generous introduction, and thank you for all that you do. I apologize in advance if I look a little blurry-eyed, but last night was the State of the Union, and if I could pass a bill, it would be that instead of at 9 o'clock, it should begin a lot earlier. But nonetheless, I thought the President did a pretty good job last night. But I'm grateful to you, Carl, and I'm grateful to everyone at the National Endowment for Democracy who has worked so hard to organize today's important conference on the prospects for democracy in the Gulf states. Thanks especially to those at NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies and to NED's partners at the Project on Middle East Democracy. I also want to recognize our very special guests from Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, some of whom I had the pleasure of meeting with yesterday. Your participation in this forum is critical for fostering a true and comprehensive discussion of democracy in the Middle East, and I want to thank you all for being here. I'm grateful to have this opportunity this morning to help call attention to the continuing struggle for democracy and human rights in Bahrain. As most of you know, and as Carl mentioned, tomorrow marks the second anniversary of the popular uprising in that country. Like many peoples across the Middle East, Bahrainis, especially the Shia majority, began a call that day for change of Bahrain's political and economic structures that have long treated them as second-class citizens. They called for respect for their fundamental human rights, including their rights to peacefully assemble and to freely express their political beliefs without fear of reprisal. Unfortunately, reprisal was how the government of Bahrain chose to respond in February 2011, and regrettably, it has continued to do so throughout the past 2 years with sometimes shocking brutality. As the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, or the BICI, confirmed in November of 2011, the Bahraini authorities systematically used excessive force against protesters during the period of February to March of 2011. Based on 9,000 testimonies that the BICI obtained, The widely respected document reported 46 deaths, 559 allegations of torture, as well as forced confessions and the unjust prosecution of medical personnel who treated injured protesters, a flagrant violation of the principle of medical neutrality. All this is in addition to the wrongful termination en masse of employees, mostly Shiites, suspected to have participated in the protests. As Carl mentioned, I co-chair the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in the U.S. House of Representatives. And in that capacity, I have had the opportunity to hear from individuals who experienced the heavy-handed tactics of Bahrain security forces. In a meeting with the Commission, one Bahraini medical doctor described how security forces in the country had at various times used tear gas against demonstrators in a lethal manner. In the doctor's words, and I quote, "I saw bodies destroyed by tear gas canisters, fired at close range. We did not know how to treat the wounds because we had never before seen such injuries," end quote. In response to the BICI report, the government of Bahrain has made some progress. Bahrain accepted the criticisms of the report and established a national commission to implement the document's 26 recommendations. Although the National Commission's progress has received criticism for its insufficient progress, it has taken some positive steps to conform to the BICI's recommendations. Specifically, the government has transferred some trials from military to civilian courts. It has reinstated over 92% of fired workers. It has produced a new code of police conduct, and it has established a compensation fund for the victims of torture that has settled at least 17 cases and awarded more than $2.6 million to claimants. Yet, even as the National Commission has worked to implement the recommendations of the BICI, cases of human rights abuses and impunity have continued. In particular, the recommendations calling for accountability at all levels of the chain of command for human rights abuses, the integration of all Bahraini communities into the security forces, and the release of all individuals who have been engaged only in peaceful political expression have not been implemented. Just yesterday, I met with Maryam al-Hawaja, the daughter of one of these prisoners, Abdul Hadi al-Hawaja. And I apologize for my struggling pronouncing some of these names. I'm from Massachusetts. I don't even speak English very well, so I want you to know. But he's the former president of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights. He was arrested on April 9th, 2011. He was sentenced to life imprisonment later that summer. Abdul Hadi experienced physical and psychological torture, a 110-day hunger strike, and indefinite terms of imprisonment. Yet throughout this ordeal, he has continued to call for peaceful resistance. Last month, Bahrain's highest appeals court upheld his conviction and his life sentence, as well as those of 13 other prominent activists. Currently, their only hope for release is a highly unlikely pardon from the king. In another case, Nabil Rajab, Abdul Hadi's successor as president of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights and the director of the Gulf Center for Human Rights, is now serving a 3-year prison sentence for participating in protests against his government. Rajab is a prisoner of conscience, jailed solely for peacefully exercising his right to freedom of expression and assembly. Mr. Rajab's recent convictions and the upholding of the military verdict against opposition figures are evidence that the kingdom's promise of reform and dialogue have not been fulfilled. As part of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission's new Defending Freedoms project, I have adopted Nabil as a prisoner of conscience, and I am dedicated to seeing that his conviction is overturned and his immediate release is secured. I was also deeply concerned to learn last August at a commission hearing looking at the implementation of the BICI that security forces continue to conduct raids on the homes of suspected dissidents and protesters. I find very disturbing the government's decision last October to impose a ban on all public demonstrations. Credible sources confirm that journalists and NGOs continue to face difficulty trying to enter Bahrain. Meanwhile, the government of Bahrain has moved forward with stripping the citizenship of many individuals in Bahrain, effectively rendering its own people stateless. But let's be very clear. We cannot limit our concern for peace and democracy in Bahrain to the implementation of the BICI recommendations. Even if they were fully implemented, the report does not address the inadequate distribution of political power or the systematic discrimination of Bahrain's Shia majority, both of which have driven popular uprisings in Bahrain even before February 2011. Although the government of Bahrain's willingness to engage in a national dialogue allowed it to move in the right direction, true peace and security depends on the opportunity for all Bahrainis to participate fully in Bahrain's political and economic life. The issue of full political participation is currently in the forefront, as the King of Bahrain recently extended an invitation to opposition parties to resume talks on political reforms as part of a national consensus dialogue. In July 2011, Bahrain's main opposition party, Al-Wafaq, withdrew from negotiations because the opposition was given only limited representation during the talks. In spring 2011, President Obama went so far as to say, and I quote, "You can't have a real dialogue when parts of the peaceful opposition are in jail," end quote. At this time, key members of Bahrain's political community remain imprisoned, and they are therefore prevented from participating. Opposition leaders like Nabil Rajab and Abdulhadi Alawaja must be allowed to attend and to provide the critical perspective of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights. Also, Ibrahim Sharif, the most prominent Sunni opposition figure and the head of the largest secular opposition party, must also be permitted to join. His participation would demonstrate that the democratic demands of the opposition are neither exclusively Shia nor connected to Iran, as Bahrain has asserted. For the government's part, it should send representatives with the willingness and authority to constructively engage opposition leadership. Bahrain has said, and I quote, that it is ready to sit at the table of dialogue, keen on reaching a final and comprehensive national consensus, end quote. I implore the government of Bahrain to show its commitment for such discourse by putting an end to the silencing of important political voices. You know, the violent suppression of the voices of the majority in Bahrain will not end the political polarization of the country. And let me be clear, it is polarization and exclusion that are the real threats to U.S. strategic interests, including the basing of the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, because it is polarization and exclusion that threaten stability. If we have learned anything from the last 2 years, it's that you can't keep a lid on a boiling pot. Sooner or later, it will explode. We know that backing autocracies instead of agents for democracy can have dire consequences. Support for autocratic rule in the name of stability is ultimately an unsustainable strategy and a dangerous myth, especially in a region as volatile as the Middle East and Northern Africa. The United States must stand ready to send a clear message to Bahrain that its repressive crackdown on human rights has consequences. We can do this first by refusing to strengthen and build capacity of a government that uses it to repress its own people. The administration has previously put a hold on the sale of arms that could be used against protesters, but we resumed sales of more sophisticated weapon systems in May of 2012. A complete ban on arms sales would send the clear message that there is no national security without respect for human rights. You can't have one without the other. We must be willing to tell the Khalifa regime that if repression of political voices continues to produce social instability, Bahrain will no longer meet our standards for basing our Fifth Fleet there, and we will actively pursue relocation of our ships. We cannot and we should not allow these friendly tyrants, as Carl Gershman has called them, to blackmail the United States into condoning their egregious repression. By turning a blind eye to Bahrain's blatant abuse of human rights, we perpetuate a double standard, which is unacceptable and unsustainable if we want to continue to claim being the world's flagship for democracy. We must show Bahrain that we stand with those who welcome meaningful reform and constructive dialogue, and that our true strategic allies those engaged in democratic change in Bahrain, as they are the true agents of peace and security in the region. There are many models of more democratic monarchies in the world. While change is necessary, Bahrain's monarchy need not be threatened by the need to embrace that change. There is no more time to play political games. I urge the Bahraini government to show its true will to resolve this issue in a democratic way once and for all, to come to the negotiating table and to invite genuine representation of its opposition to join them there. Changing the status quo is never easy, and it requires a great deal of work. It requires a great deal of commitment, and it requires a great deal of vision. But the Bahraini government needs to understand that suppressing democratic change is no longer an option, and that the cruel silencing of dissent is not only futile, it threatens our mutual interests in peace and stability in the region. Let me just conclude by saying that this is also a test for the United States, and it is a test as to whether we are willing to adapt some of our old ways of on one hand, supporting governments that treat their people in a oppressive way, turning a blind eye to that in the name of maintaining a military presence. If we want to be known as the leader in the world on the issue of human rights, we have to be consistent. And I know it's uncomfortable for some, and I know it's inconvenient for others, but we need to change the way we approach our policies in the Middle East, and this is one of the ways we need to do it. And I hope that we will stand. I hope that we will stand firm. I hope that we will be clear, and I hope we will send the right signals. And if we do, it will not only have a positive impact in Bahrain, but I think it will have a positive impact in countries all over the world. And I believe it will increase our own stability and our own security. So, thank you very much.
Congressman McGovern has agreed to take a few questions. Let me, before I call on people, let me just say how important I think what you said was, especially releasing Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja, Nabil Rajab, and Ibrahim Sharif from prison so that they can join the talks. I don't think we can say that often enough, that the negotiations in Poland in 1989, the roundtable talks, did not succeed, only succeeded because the real opposition was at the table with the Polish government, and you've got to have real negotiations, and thank you so much for emphasizing that point. Would anybody like? Yes, please. And please identify yourself and you'll get a mic.
Yes. John Duke Anthony, National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations. In response to the distinguished Congressman's remarks, I've been going to Bahrain since 1969. No newcomer am I to its issues, its challenges, its problems, and those linked to us. But our Achilles heel is the question of not so much people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. They do it all the time. Perhaps I'm one, none here, perhaps are bereft of blemish in that regard. But if we project ourselves empathetically into the shoes, those situations of Bahrainis, we are seen as the audacious of hypocrites. Inside the United Nations Security Council, we are seen as the Olympic champion of the violator of democratic processes, ideals, and principles. No one comes remotely close to the degree to which the United States has aborted the democratic process.
Can I ask you please to get to a question?
So I'm asking the Congressman if he might comment on whether, and if so, to what extent, the U.S. concern and needs and objectives are underwritten and weakened by the degree to which we are seen as hypocritical and practitioners of the double standard on the question of human rights and political democracy. Thank you.
And I think I tried to make the point in my speech that these double standards do undermine our security and do undermine our credibility on the issue of human rights around the world. Because, you know, on one hand, we tell one country that where we have no strategic interest that you need to clean up your act on human rights, but then we are quiet on another country where we do have a strategic interest that violates the human rights of its own people. I think we are strengthened by our consistency. And I say this all the time. I think if this country, if our country, the United States of America, stands for anything, we ought to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. I mean, that's one principle that should be unbending. You know, and to the extent that we are not consistent, I do think it makes us look hypocritical to some. And I do think it causes people who are genuinely interested in promoting more freedoms and more opportunities all over the world, I think it makes them question whether or not we will be on their side if it's inconvenient. You know, we need to have this discussion about, you know, what happens if things continue to deteriorate in Bahrain. You know, and I think we need to make it clear that there's a consequence. I mean, we can't just turn a blind eye because we have a military interest there. We need to make it clear to the rulers of that country that there will be a consequence. So I thank you for the question.
Ali Abu Zakuk, who is our great friend, just returned from Libya.
Well, thank you, Congressman.
Nice to see you.
The question is, how can we really tolerate the Saudi Arabia sending all the armaments to, you know, squash the revolt over there, and you know, talking just for the Bahraini government as if it is the only player?
No.
What can we do to the other big player, the big brother, who really doesn't like to have Bahrain have its own democratic principles being exercised?
Look, I mean, I think we, you know, I think we need to show some leadership here, and we need to draw some lines in the sand. And you know, again, you know, we can't dictate and we can't, you know, manage every situation around the world. Ultimately, what's going to happen in Bahrain is going to be determined by the people of Bahrain. What's going to happen in Saudi Arabia will ultimately be determined by the people of Saudi Arabia. We can assist in democratic reforms by making our position clear. You know, one of my critiques of the administration on the issue of Bahrain is that we haven't been so clear. You know, on one hand, we say we condemn the crackdown on human rights, and then you know, we withhold the sale of some arms, and then we kind of wink and nod and give them the arms. And you know, I mean, what is the message being sent here? You know, that we need to publicly denounce human rights so that all the people who care about human rights are satisfied, and we'll go on with business as usual. We have to break that cycle, and you know, and that's why I think that some of the things I talked about in my speech need to be put on the table, even if they are inconvenient, even if they are controversial. If we don't draw a line in the sand as human rights continue to deteriorate in Bahrain, that is not good for the people of Bahrain. We're engaged in peaceful dissent and peaceful protest, who are engaged in democratic activity. That's what that is. But it's also not good for us. And it also undermines our ability, you know, with other countries, whether it be Saudi Arabia or a number of other countries who would like to be more constructive in the region.
Yes, over there.
Hi, I'm Peter Vettner. I'm a student at a SAIS. I'm wondering about the politics of the decision making, where there was a push to not sell arms to Bahrain, and then some of the arms sale went through, and I guess different senators might have been on different sides about this. I've heard that Obama was sort of asked not to talk to mention Bahrain, even you know, even in his sort of veiled comment about, you know, you can't have reform with the opposition locked up, right? Because otherwise, maybe United Arab Emirates would have refused assistance in Libya. So there's like some American politicians are like you, a couple, are pushing for human rights, and others seem to be pushing against it. And I think it'd be nice if the American public were more involved and knew more of the specifics about the decision making, about the you know, which politicians are on which side on this. And you know, why do we change our minds like this? I mean, it's not a single bunch of people. Isn't the resource curse at play if there are some senators who are sort of more interested in security than human rights and sort of emphasize that side of things, America's economic advantage. So I just would like to know more about that.
Well, welcome to Washington, where you can find somebody who's on any side of the issue. And what I've learned is that sometimes there are not just two sides of an issue here, there are like 20 sides of an issue in Washington. But look, I think a couple of things have happened. One, I need to be totally frank, Bahrain was not very much part of our discussions here in Congress, until we saw the crackdown, until we saw this attempt by people to want to engage in constructive and peaceful dialogue, and we saw this terrible reprisal. Then all of a sudden, it kind of emerged as a place where we need to pay some attention. That's number one. Number two, for most politicians here in Washington who never really took the time to understand what the situation was in Bahrain to begin with, they only looked at this as a national security issue. We have a U.S. military strategic interest here. Isn't that good for us? We can have our military people there, and in case anything goes wrong, that will be a good base for us to have. So now, some of these same people who never took the time to learn about the realities of Bahrain, but who nonetheless supported our military strategic interests, are being confronted with the realities. That this is a country that's beginning to boil over. That not only are people demanding their rights, their legitimate rights, but you have a government that is being incredibly repressive. And so it is inconvenient, it is for politicians, it is not an easy discussion for politicians. And when you talk about, relocating the fleet, you get somebody who's like, oh my, how could you do that with all the turmoil in the Middle East? And, what's going to happen if something goes on with Iran? And, you have 1,000 excuses. So, national security should trump everything. What we're trying to say here, and I really appreciate Ned doing this, because it is now making this issue more part of our discussion. But what we need to do is we need to make it clear to the President and to others in Congress that you can't separate national security issues from human rights issues. If you have a human rights problem, you don't have your national security is not enhanced. And I think, look, I want there to be a happy ending here. I want the Bahraini government to kind of take a new look at this and figure out a way whether to move forward in a constructive way. But they need to know that if they don't, that there's a consequence. And we need to make that known to other members of Congress and the administration. But I think, I'll just say this finally, the more people understand what's happening on the ground in Bahrain, the more concern. The concern on this, over the last year, and I think Carl can attest to this as well, more people are talking about Bahrain in Congress, more people are worried about the human rights situation than there were a year ago. And that interest and that concern will only intensify, and I think that will result in a consequence.
Congressman, let me pose just a final question to you, because we're going to have to move on. But I mentioned in my introduction that you were one of the really real leaders in the Congress in the passage of the Magnitsky Act. As we go forward in Bahrain and there's no progress, is it possible that the Magnitsky idea, the idea for this kind of legislation, could be applied to a country like Bahrain?
Absolutely. One of the things that we had wanted, and the way I say Senator Cardin and myself, Senator Cardin authored the Magnitsky language in the Senate, I did in the House. We wanted it to apply globally. We thought it would be better globally. We had some resistance from people in the administration and from some of our colleagues in Congress, so it was narrowed down. My hope is that we could still make it global. But in the absence of legislation, the administration still can implement kind of the Magnitsky Act and apply it to Bahrain or any other country. And basically, what it does is it says that, that human rights abusers, no matter where they are in government, will be held accountable by us not allowing them to have visas to come to the United States and take their kids to Disney World or tour the country or visit Washington or have meetings with politicians. That if you have investments here in the United States and bank accounts and other kind of financial interests, we could freeze those. And I really think that should be our our approach all over the world. And with regard to Bahrain, I mean, as things get worse, I mean, that is another consequence, another tool that can be used. But I think it is very, very important for us, if we truly embrace the principles of human rights, to behave like we do. And that means more than speeches, more than talks, more than saying we all care about human rights. It means when you have human rights violators, you use whatever lever you have to pressure them to change their ways. There has to be a consequence to bad behavior. If not, it will occur over and over and over again. And the situation of Bahrain, as I am watching this unfold, as I am talking to people there, is getting worse. Is getting worse. And this is an important time for the United States and the international community to speak up.
Congressman, I want to thank you for everything that you do. Thank you for adopting Nabil Rajab as a prisoner of conscience. I didn't know that. That's really terrific. Thank you for mentioning the other prisoners like Abdul Hadi Al-Khawaja and Ibrahim Sharif. And thank you for everything you do.
Thank you.